Good afternoon and welcome to today's presentation, an overview of firearms laws for all legal professionals. The information presented by the expert is not to be used as legal advice and does not indicate a working relationship with the expert. All materials obtained from this presentation are merely for educational purposes and should not be used in a court of law, sans the expert's consent, i.e. a business relationship where she or he is hired for your particular case. In today's webinar, Ross will discuss who can own a gun, buying or selling process of firearms, carrying firearms in public, coming issues to watch for. To give you a little background about our presenter, Ross Archer has practiced law for more than 30 years and is of counsel to Roberts, Markle, Weinberg, Butler, Haley, PC in Houston, Texas. Ross is a former United States Army infantry officer and has served as a rifle platoon leader on the demilitarized zone of the Republic of Korea. For the past 9 years, he has been certified as a state of Texas licensed to carry handgun instructor and is also certified by the National Rifle Association as a basic pistol instructor. Ross is the founder and chief instructor with Pistola Handgun Training, a firearms training firm in Houston, Texas. Attendees who require a passcode, the word for today is firearms. During the Q&A session, we ask that you enter this passcode into the Q&A widget for CLE reporting purposes. The Q&A is located to the left of your screen. Please remember that if you are applying for CLE credit, you must log on to your computer as yourself and stay for the full 60 minutes. You are also required to complete the survey at the end of the program. Please note that CLE credit cannot be given to those watching together on a single computer. Tomorrow morning, I will send out an email with a link to the archived recording of the webinar. The slides can be downloaded from the resource list at the widget at the bottom of your screen. Thank you all for attending today, and Ross, the presentation is now turned over to you.
Thank you, Naja. Thank you for being here. Thanks for being here today, everybody. I'm really happy to be with you. I trust that everybody is staying safe and healthy at this time, and you're finding ways to remain productive in your practices. When Naja and I started talking about this seminar about 5 months ago, we knew it would be a good subject, but we didn't realize that it would be a very timely subject. If you follow any firearms-related news, then you know that anytime there is a crisis, a perceived crisis, an emergency, people start getting concerned about their safety, and firearm sales and ammunition sales all of a sudden spike. And that has certainly happened in the past couple of months with the coronavirus issues. People wonder, will there be food shortages? Will there be other problems? Will there be riots? Will there be looting? And people who've never owned guns all of a sudden see that maybe they want to get a gun to protect themselves, their home, their families. And we've seen a lot of that in the past couple of months. So you may be in a position to advise clients, whether existing or new clients, on some firearms-related laws, because a lot of the people who rush out to buy guns or ammunition in a perceived crisis are usually new gun owners who don't really have a lot of knowledge. So this may be an area where you have the opportunity to be of service to some folks. So let's start with some of the real basics. We're going to talk about a general overview of firearms, and of course that can vary from state to state. Federal law is going to cut across all states, of course, but every state may have some things that put different requirements on that the federal law does not. And please understand that since I don't practice in all the states, this is not legal advice in any state. This is general information. So now, who can own a gun? Well, I don't know any of you on this call, but I'm going to guess probably every one of you can own a gun. The two main requirements under federal law for owning a gun are age and criminal record. If you are 18 years old and you do not have a felony conviction, you can own a rifle or a shotgun. If you are 21 years of age and you do not have a felony conviction, you can own a handgun under federal law. When it comes to felony convictions, remember, if you own a gun legally and you are with your cousin Joe who wants to go to the range and shoot with you, but you know cousin Joe has a felony conviction, no matter how long ago it was, no matter what it was, don't take Joe to the range with you and loan him your gun, because now you are guilty of providing a firearm to a felon. Just don't do that. Every state, of course, might have additional restrictions and requirements for owning a gun, but actually there's not a lot of restrictions as to what you have to do in terms of owning a gun. I've got a question. What about immigration status? My sister-in-law was a Mexican national. She was here as a resident legal alien. She not only owned guns, but she took one of my classes and she received her Texas license to carry a handgun. So if you are here on a legal status, yes, that is not an impediment to owning a gun. Now, how in the world do you get a gun? Okay, I know that I can own a gun, but what is the process for getting one legally? Well, again, there's not that many restrictions, not that many requirements or impediments under federal law. Under federal law, if I go into a dealer, and we're going to cover two different ways to buy a gun, a dealer sale and a private transfer. If I go to a dealer, somebody who has a federal firearms license or an FFL, that's going to be your sporting goods stores, it's going to be your gun stores, rifle or pistol ranges that sell guns, your next door neighbor who may have a federal firearms license, and occasionally he deals professionally as a business in buying and selling guns. You go to that FFL, you fill out a federal form, 4473. It's a fairly simple form, doesn't have a lot of information, but it basically identifies you. You swear to some things like I'm not a felon, I'm not presently under a felony indictment, et cetera, et cetera. And the dealer puts the description of the gun that you want to buy on that form. The dealer then takes your personal information and he puts it on the computer, which he sends to the FBI. The FBI has an instant background check system, and in most cases, it is pretty much instant. It is, under a lot of circumstances, it will take only a matter of a few minutes for the FBI to check your information, your social security number, your name, your date of birth, and so on, and they will send back a yes or no to the dealer. Sell him the gun or don't sell him the gun. It's important to know that at that point, the FBI does not know what gun you're trying to buy or how many guns you're trying to buy. All they're saying is, yes, you can sell the gun to this guy, or no, you cannot. So the dealer at that point says, okay, the FBI says you're good. You may actually change your mind at that point and say, you know what? I'm not going to buy that gun after all. I think I can get it cheaper someplace else. Or you may say, I'm going to buy that gun and I'm going to buy these other 3 guns. Once you're cleared to buy the gun, the dealer can sell you that gun or any other gun, or you can change your mind and not buy it. This is not a matter of federal registration. There is no federal registration scheme for firearms. Some states may have state registration systems. The federal government does not. When you fill out that form and the dealer sells you that gun, the dealer does not send a copy of that form to the federal government saying, I sold him this gun with this serial number and so on. The dealer keeps a record of it, and the dealer has to be very meticulous about keeping those records, but that is between you and the dealer. And although the federal government can come in and audit those dealers' records, it's not a federal registration system. I've got a question. What if you have a 30-year-old gun arrest with no convictions? If you do not have a felony conviction or you are not currently under indictment for a felony, then you are clear under federal law to buy a gun. Are fingerprints required? Someone is asking. Not under the federal system. Some states may require a state permit for buying a gun, and under some state permits, you may be required to give fingerprints. Under the federal law, no. Federal law is actually fairly lenient in terms of buying a gun. You don't have to have a buyer permit. You don't have to have a license. There's no waiting period required under federal law. Some of those things may be required under different state laws, but not under the federal system. Now, an interesting thing is, I have a Texas license to carry a handgun. Before I could get my Texas license to carry a handgun, I had to be fingerprinted, and I had to have a background check performed to make sure that I had no felony convictions. Therefore, the very fact that I have my license to carry means that a background check has already been done. So when I go into a dealer to buy a gun, they don't even have to send off to the FBI to get permission, because I've already had that FBI check done in order to get my license to carry. So sometimes you've already cleared that hurdle before you walk into the gun store. And remember, some states you have to have a state permit, you have to have a license, there may be a waiting period before you can purchase a gun, even though there's not under the federal system. Someone's asking, what is a gun stamp? The only gun stamp that I know of is for what we call Class 3 weapons, which we're going to cover in a few minutes. How long are FFL dealers required to hold transaction records? And that's a real good question that I don't know the answer to, because I'm not an FFL. I do know there is a certain statutory or regulatory period that they're required to maintain them, and it's not a matter of months. It is a matter of some years. Now, what if I don't want to buy a gun from a dealer? What if I go to your house and I see a gun that you've got and I say, man, I really like that gun. Will you sell it to me? And we go back and forth and we arrive at a price and you say, yeah, I'll sell it to you. A private sale of firearms is totally legal under federal law. You have to live in the same state. You cannot have an interstate private sale of firearms. if you have an interstate private sale, you have to go to an FFL and have him do the paperwork, because that's no longer an intrastate transaction. But as long as you and I live in the same state, we can buy and sell guns from each other. We can trade guns. I can give you a gun as a gift. I can leave you a gun in my will. Intrastate transfer of firearms is totally legal under federal law. There is no FFL required. There is no background check required. Now, even though there's no paperwork required, you may decide that just for your own protection, you want to get a bill of sale. You want there to be if I sell you a gun and later on you go use that gun in a crime and the gun is somehow traced back to me, I may want a bill of sale to say, hey, officer, I no longer own that gun. Here's the bill of sale. I sold it to this guy 3 years ago. And so for both the buyer's and the seller's protection, you may want to have a bill of sale, which you simply keep in your own possession if there's any question as to where the gun came from or where it went. Now, some states, again, do have more restrictions upon private transfers. So always make sure that you check in your own state, and you have checked any additional requirements so that you don't run afoul of any local laws. Now, we had a question about a gun stamp. Let's talk about something we call Class 3 firearms, or what we sometimes call NFA items, National Firearms Act. And yes, you can own a machine gun. There are a number of people in the country who do. It is not illegal, but there are a few more restrictions on it. Back in the 1930s, when Al Capone and all the other gangsters were running around and they were all using machine guns and hiding sawed-off shotguns and short-barreled rifles and all kinds of things under their coats that they could pull out and use in whatever criminal endeavors they were doing. The National Firearms Act of 1934 was passed. In that act, certain items were made restricted items. Not illegal items, but restricted items. And in order to own one of those restricted items, you had to apply to the federal government and you had to pay a $200 tax in order to receive a tax stamp saying that you could own that gun. Made it so that there were some extra hoops to go through, and that the law is still essentially the same today. It's still a $200 tax, which you have to submit along with your application. The federal government has to issue a special tax stamp giving you authorization. And it's a little more difficult because not only is it difficult for you, you can't sell me that gun in a private transaction unless I have a tax stamp to buy that gun. So it does restrict certain items, makes it more difficult to own, but for those who want to own those items, there are many of them out there today. This is fully automatic firearms, short-barreled rifles or shotguns, suppressors or silencers, things that are known as destructive devices, explosives or firearms with a bore diameter greater than a ½ inch. There are places you can go and pay to drive a tank and shoot an actual tank cannon with actual tank cannon ammunition, because those folks have done the special paperwork to own those destructive devices. And it can be done. Not in my budget, but it can be done. Now, Again, just because the federal government allows that, that does not mean that the state cannot put additional requirements on it, and many states do. In some states, it may be totally illegal to own a fully automatic weapon, even though the federal government says it's fine as long as you have the proper documentation. How about carrying firearms in public? In the past 20 or 30 years, this has become very, very common. In some states, there are millions of people who have licenses to carry their handgun in public. This varies a lot from state to state. There is no federal prohibition against carrying a firearm in public, except on federal property. Don't walk into the post office with your concealed handgun, even though you have a state permit to carry a concealed handgun. The federal government does not recognize that state permit or a license. But other than that, the federal government has very little that they care to say about carrying firearms in public. Every state has its own rules, and those rules can vary tremendously. In some states, you can openly carry a handgun without a license. But if you want to carry it concealed, you have to have a license. In some states, like Texas, if you have a license to carry a handgun, it gives you the authority to carry either openly or concealed. In some states, you can carry concealed, but not openly. There are restricted places. For example, 99% of the places I go, I can carry a handgun on my body. But there are places which are statutory, such as schools, bars, polling places, other places like that, which the state of Texas sets out as places that I cannot carry in spite of my license to carry. And every state is going to have certain restrictions like that. So always check with your own state or the state where you might be traveling. Some states have what they refer to as constitutional carry. They say, Constitution says you have a right to keep and bear arms. That's good enough for us. We're not going to issue any licenses. You just carry because the Constitution says you can. Most states have been getting more and more liberal in terms of their licensing laws over the years, opening up more and more opportunity for law-abiding citizens who can pass the background checks to carry a gun. It's become much more widespread, and I'll talk in a little bit about how we see how it has not been any contributor to crime. Reciprocity is a really interesting question. I haven't traveled much as a lawyer in a couple of years, but for about 15 years, I was national counsel for a particular company, and I handled a certain type of lawsuit for that company all around the country. I traveled to many states, and I carried my handgun to many states. And I carried in those states because Texas and those states have reciprocal licensing agreements. Just like the state of Pennsylvania recognizes my Texas driver's license, the state of Pennsylvania recognizes my Texas license to carry a handgun, and vice versa. Currently, Texas has about 38 states that it has reciprocity agreements with. And so it's very easy for me to travel to a lot of the country and carry my handgun with the authority of my Texas license to carry. And by the same token, people in those states can come to Texas and carry their handgun with their New Mexico or Minnesota or whatever other license to carry they have in their state. Reciprocity is a very important part of handgun ownership, because it doesn't mean your right to self-defense ends at the state line. Well, how in the world do you get your gun to the other states? Actually, it's pretty easy to travel on an airplane with a firearm. You have to put your gun in a hard case with a lock on it, and when you go and check your baggage, because of course it's got to go in your check baggage under the plane, you simply tell the person at the baggage counter, I have a firearm to declare. And in most cases, you go through about a 5-minute process. And the gun goes in your bag, you retrieve your bag when you get to your destination, and you take your gun out. It is very, very simple to carry a gun on an airline. Just please don't try to take it onto the seating area of the plane with you. They tend to take issue with that. One of the things I like to do is to bust myths when it comes to firearms. I've always believed that one of the greatest roles of a lawyer is to educate clients and prospective clients, and even the public in general, as to the law. There are a lot of myths and legends in different areas of the law, and probably no area of the law has more myths and legends than firearms laws. Many people learn about guns from TV and the movies, and much of what TV and the movies does is get it wrong. So let's bust some myths here. Guns fire when they're dropped. Everybody has seen the movie where somebody drops a gun and it fires. Well, not so much. Sure, if you got a really, really old gun made before 1968, that is a possibility. But the Gun Control Act of 1968 put in place some federal requirements for firearm safety, and one of those requirements is that guns had to have some internal mechanism, some mechanical mechanism, which would prevent the mere inertia from the gun being dropped from firing the gun. There are different ways that this is done in different types of guns, but I guarantee you, I've been on firing ranges a lot over the years. I've seen people clumsily drop a gun onto a concrete floor, and I've never seen a gun fire because they just don't do that unless it is a really, really old gun made without the internal mechanisms that we have nowadays, or unless somebody has tinkered with that gun who didn't know what they were doing and they have disabled certain safety mechanisms. How many of you, and I'll bet you everybody should raise your hand at this, how many of you have heard a news report where perhaps a police officer is struggling with a suspect to subdue the suspect, and somebody gets shot, and the reporter says, the gun went off during the struggle? My friends, guns don't go off. That's kind of like saying the car started or the ceiling light came on. If the ceiling light came on, it's because I threw the switch. If the car started, it's because I turned the key. If the gun went off, it's because somebody pulled the trigger. Guns don't go off. Somebody fired the gun. And when you hear that term, the gun went off, you know that somebody pulled a trigger on that gun, and that's what made the gun go off. It wasn't the mere fact that people were struggling over the gun that caused the gun to fire. You've probably all heard people talking about the fact that we need to get rid of this gun show loophole for buying guns. Why, anybody can go into a gun show and they can buy a gun without any background check, without any paperwork, et cetera, et cetera. We've got to do away with these gun show loopholes. Well, there is no such thing as a gun show loophole. If I walk into a gun show, there are probably going to be many tables of licensed dealers there. And in addition, there may be some individuals wanting to sell guns on a private sale basis. The same laws apply at the gun show. If I buy a gun from a federal firearms licensed dealer at the gun show, I still have to fill out the same federal form. The dealer still has to send in a request for approval to the FBI, or I have to show my handgun license to show that I've already had that done. If I buy from an individual there, I'm buying under the same rules that I would buy if we were at his home or my home. There are no special laws, no more lax provisions inside a gun show as there are outside a gun show. So when you hear somebody talking about a gun show loophole, that is a fiction. It does not exist, and the same rules apply inside the gun show as outside. How many of you have ever heard about plastic guns that can slip through metal detectors? This myth first began a few decades ago, primarily when Glock handguns first began to flood the market. Oh, these are plastic guns. They can go through metal detectors. People are going to be able to hijack airliners with them, and they're going to be able to get into other secure places because the metal detector can't detect that plastic. Well, in the first place, if you have ever seen a so-called plastic gun, and there are many guns made of different types of polymers today, you realize that the so-called plastic part is only the frame of the gun. The gun will still have certain steel parts, such as the barrel, the slide, the internal working mechanisms, firing pin, hammer, springs, because those parts, nobody has figured out a way to make those parts out of plastic and have them actually hold up when the gun fires. So these plastic guns are only partly plastic. And if you're going to take an entire gun through a metal detector, even if the so-called plastic part does not show up, the rest of the gun will. And by the way, what about the ammunition? A gun's not worth much without ammunition, and the ammunition is made of metallic parts, such as lead or copper or brass. The ammunition would have to slip through the metal detector too, and that's not going to happen. One of the things which we started hearing years ago when more and more states started going to carry permits is that concealed carry or open carry of handguns by private citizens is going to lead to more violence. We're going to have blood in the streets because anytime we have a fender bender accident, the drivers are going to get mad at each other, and there's going to be some shooting going on. Well, I don't know how good other states are at doing this, but I know in Texas, it's very easy to go to our state police, the Department of Public Safety, to go to their website, and year by year, you can look up every criminal offense that for which there was a conviction in that year, and you can see how many of those convictions went to non-concealed carry holders as opposed to concealed carry license holders. For example, 2018 is the latest year we have complete records in Texas. In that year, there were 41,000 total criminal convictions in Texas. Of those 41,000, people who had licenses to carry accounted for 163 of those offenses. In other words, less than 0.5% of crimes are committed by guys who have licenses to carry. And the numbers are fairly similar in other states where those numbers are available. And why would you think that's so? Well, if I'm a criminal and I want to carry a gun, I'm just going to go steal one or buy it on the black market, and I'm just going to stick it in my pocket or my pants and carry a gun illegally. That's what criminals do. Folks like me and the other 2 million or so Texans who have licenses to carry handguns, we go through background checks. We pay a fee to the state. We pay a fee to an instructor for a required class. We have fingerprints done. Guys who do that sort of thing are generally pretty law-abiding citizens. They're not people who are getting guns for the purpose of going out and committing crimes with them. The people who have licenses to carry in any state, who have jumped through the hoops, who have gone to the trouble of doing that sort of thing, are generally the most law-abiding people in that state. They're the kind of folks you hopefully want for your neighbors. All right, how about some more firearms myths? I like doing this because I know a lot of you have heard these things. How about these AK-47s and AR-15 assault rifles or assault weapons? They're the kind of guns that criminals use all the time. We need to put more restrictions on those. Well, you might still believe that, but at least I want to arm you with some facts. If you look at actual crime statistics, those type of so-called assault rifles are only used in about 2% of crimes involving firearms. Now, that's a pretty small percentage. Sure, if you have a crime where one of those is used, it does get a lot of publicity, but part of that is because they're used so seldom. It's hard to conceal an AR-15 or an AK-47 if you're walking into a bank to rob a bank. You've got to be pretty open and blatant to carry a gun that size. Somebody's probably going to see you, and maybe one of the good guys who has a license to carry might take action on his own. Actually, that's happened in a couple of different church shootings in Texas, in Colorado, in other places. It's amazing if you look up defensive use of firearms, you'll see how many good guys actually use firearms to stop crimes before the police arrive. How about the myth that the murder rate is rising in this country? Well, FBI statistics show that we hit our highest peak of murder rates in this country in 1993. And there has been a steady decline in that murder rate until today, where we are at about half the rate we were at in 1993. Now, think about this. Since 1993, there has been a steady increase in gun ownership and a steady increase in people carrying guns legally, but the murder rate has steadily decreased. I'm not a great statistician, but I don't think that bodes well for people saying that gun ownership and gun carrying leads to more violent crime. Now, there are a lot of people who will say that the private use of firearms does not prevent crime. If you look at figures published by the Centers for Disease Control, and I personally find it a little funny that Centers for Disease Control keeps records of firearms deaths and the use of firearms. That doesn't sound like a disease to me, but okay, they want to do that, that's fine. They actually keep records of this sort of thing, and depending upon how you interpret those records, at a minimum, the CDC records show that there are probably several 100,000 legal defensive uses of firearms every year in this country. Some people who analyze those records place the number several times higher than that. I want to use the minimal figures so as not to try to inflate the argument. Remember, legal use, a legal defensive use, doesn't necessarily mean you pulled out your gun and you caused the death of an armed robber. It could mean you pulled out a gun, he saw the gun, and he turned and ran. It could mean you pulled the gun, you shot, and you wounded him. It does not mean there were several 100,000 deaths as a result of defensive uses of firearms, but it does show how much the federal government, as a minimum, says that law-abiding citizens use guns every year in order to prevent crime. So to those who say the private use of firearms does not prevent crime, I say, and the federal government says, that that's probably not correct. What about coming issues to watch for? I think any one of us, in whatever area of law we practice, likes to stay ahead of the game, see what bills are being introduced, see what court cases are out there pending, trying to figure out what's coming next in the area of law that we practice and we're interested in. And so certainly I do that when it comes to firearms laws. For several years, there have been moves in Congress to pass a National Reciprocity Act in terms of licenses to carry handguns. The logic is, if other states have to recognize my driver's license, why would they not recognize my license to carry? After all, I had to jump through hoops to get it. I had to have a background check. I had to do all these different things in my own state. Why would another state not honor that license? And why would my right of self-defense end at my own state line? And so while this has not passed Congress yet, it is pretty much being reintroduced every session of Congress. And so you'll probably see this again and again. And obviously, like any other law, it's the makeup of the houses of Congress and whoever is in the White House that will eventually determine which of these things might or might not pass. Removal of suppressors from the National Firearms Act. Suppressors or silencers are one of those restricted items that you have to have a special tax stamp in order to possess or use. It's against the federal law to have one in your possession without that tax stamp. If you know about silencers from watching TV, where a silenced gun goes piff, 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 then you don't know much about silencers. Most firearms put out about 120 to 160 or more decibels. That's loud. A suppressor will generally reduce the sound of a gunshot about 20 to 30 decibels. So if I've got a gun which fires at about 140 decibels of noise, and a suppressor knocks that down to about 120, that's still rock concert noise. It's still loud. Don't be misled into thinking that a silencer is going to make a gun so silent that somebody can walk into a room, fire a few shots, and walk out, and nobody ever knows that a crime's been committed. It does not come anywhere close to silencing a gun. It makes it a little less loud, but it does help some in terms of hearing loss. If you go to the range a lot and you shoot a lot, even though you have on hearing protection, you're still getting some noise through the hearing protection. And if you can lower that noise level by about 20 decibels, then over the years, that will help to preserve hearing. And so it's actually a health and safety issue. It's not a crime prevention issue. So we expect to see this come up again, although it's not passed Congress yet. Universal background checks. That has come up over and over again. You'll hear that call. And remember, I said if you're buying a gun through a licensed dealer, you have to have the background check done anyway. The only way to escape a background check is to do a private sale. And so what universal background checks is really attempting to do is simply outlaw the private sale of firearms from one person to another. Some universal background check proposals even say you can't will grandpa's shotgun to the grandson and pass it down in the family unless the grandson has had a background check, because every gun transfer should require a background check. And so the universal background check issue will come up. I will tell you right now, the vast majority of guns sold in this country are already sold with background checks because a dealer is required to do them anytime a commercial sale of a gun is made. Assault rifle regulation. Remember, we talked about how few crimes are actually committed with so-called assault rifles. And I use the word so-called. Let me explain that to those of you who don't really understand the term. Assault rifle began its life as a military term. And a gun had to have certain characteristics in order to properly be called an assault rifle. And without going into all the characteristics, one of the keys was it had to be capable of both semi-automatic fire and fully automatic fire by means of some sort of selector switch. If it was not capable of fully automatic fire, then by definition, it was not an assault rifle. Well, during the Clinton administration, Congress passed the assault rifle ban. It was a 10-year sunsetted type law, which would expire if not renewed, and it was not renewed at the end of 10 years. That assault rifle ban redefined, not for military purposes, but for political purposes, what an assault rifle was. An assault rifle no longer, under the terms of that law, was no longer required to be capable of fully automatic fire. Instead, it had to have certain characteristics. If it had a folding stock, if it had a pistol grip, if it was capable of semi-automatic fire, if it fed from a detachable box magazine, if it had a bayonet stud on it. Now, I don't know too many crimes that are committed with a criminal putting a bayonet on the end of a rifle and going in and robbing a bank, but that was one of the things. If it had a certain number of these physical characteristics, then it qualified as an assault rifle. And so you'll hear many people use that term assault rifle or assault weapon, and it has really become misdefined over the years for purposes of, I really think, just putting a stigma on a certain type of firearm when that firearm does not really carry the characteristics of an assault rifle. Armed school employees is going to be an issue. Some places are already passing laws that certain school employees may carry firearms. I've not seen any laws that require any school employees to carry firearms, but because we know from experience that if there is a school shooter, it takes at least some number of minutes for police to arrive. And even then, it often takes some number of minutes for police to consolidate on the scene, figure out who's going in where. And in those minutes, a shooter can do a lot of damage to innocent people. There are those who say, if you've got a trained, licensed, approved, armed teacher or administrator who can take immediate action against a shooter, then we can save a lot of lives that would be lost waiting for the police. Other people say that's ridiculous. Teachers have no business being police officers. Whatever side of that you come down on, just know that there are different jurisdictions which are looking seriously at providing certain schemes where school employees might be armed in order to be a first line of defense against a shooter. Another thing to remember is this is an election year. Things always change in election years. People are always wondering and worrying, what's the makeup of Congress going to be? Who will be the president? If Congress passes certain laws, will there be a president who is in agreement with those laws, or will there be a president who might veto those laws? We always see a lot of speculation about what's going to happen with laws during an election year. One side trying to push laws through because they might not be there the next time. One side trying to block certain laws because they don't know who's going to be in power the next time. There's always a lot of volatility in any area of the law in an election year, and certainly that's true of firearm laws just like anything else. So that's something to watch for. I hope I haven't tried to throw too much in too quickly, but I'd like to have a few questions. If you have some things you want to ask, I'm here. I'm happy to talk to you. And before I answer any questions, let me tell you, you can arrange through TASA for a consultation. You can arrange that we can get together, talk about any issues you might have, and I'm happy to do that. This is what I do. It's a subject I enjoy. Hopefully I know enough about it to speak intelligently, and I'm ready to answer any questions if you have any.
Perfect. Ross, there are 2 questions that I have in the team chat for you, and if all the attendees can type in the passcode, that'd be perfect.
Let's see, are they team chat? Let's see.
The first one would be what about a domestic conviction?
Domestic conviction. Domestic convictions, and again, this varies a lot from state to state, but if it is a domestic conviction, definitely some states are going to say, even if it's a misdemeanor, you do not get a license if it's a misdemeanor. I know in Texas, certain misdemeanors involving domestic convictions will disqualify you from getting a license to carry a handgun. And the domestic conviction brings up another issue which is coming up in a lot of states, and that is so-called red flag laws. You may have heard of these. this is a law where, let's say, I think my brother-in-law is just going off the deep end. He's drinking more. He's becoming more violent. I think he's going to do damage to my sister or himself or a neighbor. I can go down and I can tell the police, this is what I know about him. This guy should not have guns. And if the jurisdiction has a red flag law, and depending upon the extent and how that red flag law is worded, in many cases, the police can go in without any sort of criminal charges being filed, without probable cause, without a warrant from a judge, and they can take those guns from him. In some cases, they have to go before a judge, but all they need is my unsworn testimony, which gives them probable cause. It's the red flag laws vary in terms of the details. There is, a lot of people say that's great. We shouldn't have to jump through a lot of hoops if somebody's violent. Other people say, wait a minute, this is a little bit too easy. What if you have a wife who has left her abusive husband and she's going through a divorce because he has threatened her life? So he goes down and he files a red flag complaint against her. Her guns are now taken from her. Now she is helpless if he goes in and wants to assault her. So there are, as with most laws, there are two sides to look at it, and the red flag laws are a part of that domestic violence sort of picture. And so we need to look real carefully at if that law comes up in your state and what the extent of that law is, what the procedures for that law is, because there have actually been in Maryland, I know there was one man and some other state where somebody just reported somebody. The police showed up and say, hi, we're here for your guns. And he says, come and get them. And they shot it out. And the man was killed because he said, no, you're not coming in here without any hearing, without any right of due process. You're not just coming in and taking my guns. To some people, it's a very strong constitutional issue. Other people say, no, public safety trumps the Constitution. I'm not going to try to debate that issue with you. We each have our sides we come down on. But that is another one of those issues which you need to be watching out for, which will be in the news. And we have another one, Nadja?
Yes, it's right underneath that one, Ross.
Let's see. Oh, yeah. So this
it?
is kind of, can't under federal law, an individual between 18 and 20 may acquire a handgun from an unlicensed individual who resides. That's a long one. All right. So basically it's saying, is there a way for a person over 18 but under 21 to acquire a handgun from someone else in the same state? The general rule under federal law is 21 years of age for a handgun. If there is an exception to that, I'm going to have to look that up. But I know the general rule is 18 for long guns, 21 for handguns. Somebody else has to have a question. I was either so confusing or I gave you everything you possibly needed. And my wife
No, Ross,
tells
you
me
have several questions. You have several questions,
right.
And there is one in the team chat for you.
Let's see. Must a federally licensed dealer report to the local police department on sales? Not under federal law. Under federal law, there is no need for a federally licensed dealer to report to the local police department. In some jurisdictions, in order to buy a gun or in order to get a license to carry a gun, there is a requirement for what is known as the chief law enforcement officer of that jurisdiction to actually sign off on a permit. So in that case, there would be interaction between the local police and the dealer, but that is purely a local issue. There is no rule under federal law for the federal firearms license dealer to have any interaction with local or state law enforcement. Here's one. What do I do with old guns from an estate? Do they have to be registered or cleared in a background check? That depends on what you're going to do with them and where you live. In a state like Texas, I can pass them down to family members. I can distribute them to family members without any kind of paperwork, probably for my own. If I was the executor of the estate, just for my own records, I would probably make a record of each gun and who it went to. But there's not a requirement here. Certainly there is in some states. And the idea, do they have to be registered? Not with the federal government. Remember, we have no federal gun registration scheme except to the extent that you are getting one of those National Firearms Act restricted items. But that goes back to your state again. If your state requires gun registration, then the person who gets that gun is going to be under the requirement to register it. And as the one passing that gun on to them, I would certainly make sure that that is done. Again, there has to be a background check, not under federal law if it is an intrastate transfer. Under state law, you may have to do a background check even if you're just giving the gun to someone. And by the way, that's not a bad idea anyway. What if you give Grandpa's shotgun to Cousin Joe, and Cousin Joe had a felony 40 years ago that you never knew about? He is still a felon under federal law, so it might not be a bad idea to check just to make sure you're not breaking the law by passing the gun down to a felon. Here's one. Suppose you had a felony conviction that was pardoned. Are you eligible to purchase a gun? Now, here comes something which maybe some of you criminal practitioners will know something more about. There is a difference between a mere pardon, and restoration of rights. There are two different levels of pardon. Now, I don't do criminal law, but my understanding is you can be pardoned but not necessarily have all of your rights restored. And again, you can be pardoned with an order which specifically restores your rights. And I would check to find out if a pardon actually had the language which restored rights, because I have heard of pardons which simply take away the conviction but do not take away the actual record of the pardon, which deprives you of certain rights. And so I would check very carefully with a criminal practitioner in your state who is familiar with pardons, expungements, restorations of rights, and so on. Do any states require safety or skills, competence, or proof of safe storage? There are certain states which, for example, in Texas, if I'm going to get my license to carry, not to buy a gun, but to get my license to carry, I have to not only take a class, I have to pass a written test on certain laws and safety practices and so on, and then I have to go to a range with the instructor who's been certified by the state, and I have to fire a certain number of rounds of ammunition over a certain prescribed course of fire, and I have to score a certain level on that range qualification test. So I don't have to show competency with the gun in order to buy a gun, but I do have to show competency with the gun in order to get my license to carry the gun. And so that is going to vary between state to state, and whether you're talking about simply buying a gun or carrying a gun, because it's not one size fits all. I bought the gun, therefore I can do anything with it I want. I've got the gun. I may have to take a hunter safety course if I intend to hunt with the gun. I may have to take a license to carry course if I'm going to carry the gun. So there may be different requirements, and in safe storage, you will find more and more states, and I'll give you Texas for an example. Texas, several years back, passed a state law which holds a parent liable if he fails to secure a gun when he knew or should have known that a minor child would have access to that gun. And if that minor child then gets that gun and goes out and does damage with it, the parent can be held criminally responsible. So more and more states are going to safe storage. It's not to say you can't keep a gun out in your home for home defense. You have to keep everything locked in a safe. It is very situational dependent. If you have children in your home, you have to gauge the age of the children, the maturity level of the children. Have you trained those children in firearm safety, and can you trust them around guns? Or are they kids where you say, absolutely not, I don't want a gun out around this child? You make that decision, and then you bear the legal responsibility for how well or how poorly you made that decision. Let's see. Doesn't multiple sales in a short period of time usually launch a federal investigation? And the answer is generally no. Some states do have limits, one handgun per month, or certain other limits like that. Those are state limits. There are no federal limits on how many guns you can buy at one time. Now, would some particular investigator look at that and say, this guy bought 10 of these certain guns this month and 10 more the next month? They're probably not wondering if you're out starting your own army. What they're probably wondering is, are you actually a gun dealer? You're selling guns not in private transfers like me and my neighbor selling a gun back and forth, but you're buying enough guns that you're probably actually selling guns as a business, at which point you need to have that federal firearms license, and they may come check on you to see, oh, you bought all these guns and there they all are in your big gun safe. Well, I guess you're not selling them. Oh, you bought all these guns, but they're not here. You must be selling guns, and if you're selling that many guns, you are a business. Let's talk about you getting a federal firearms license and what the penalties are for acting as a gun dealer without that license. So yeah, it may trigger something informal, but it's not against the law under federal law to buy a lot of guns in a short period of time. How do you become an FFL? It's actually pretty simple. I have friends of mine who have federal firearms licenses. They will buy and sell a couple of guns a year. They're not big-time dealers. They just sell out of their home. It's just a matter of paperwork. You apply to the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Division. You fill out certain paperwork. You pay a fee. They do a background check. It's a fairly simple process, and most folks, if they had a mind to do so, could become an FFL. It's a pretty simple process of application with ATF. All right, I'm going to get some other questions via email, which I will try to answer in writing later on. Thank you, Naja and TASA, for making this available to me to make this presentation today. thanks to all of you for being there. I really enjoyed this. I hope I can maybe be of service to some of you in the future. Please don't hesitate to call on us if we can help you.
Yes, thank you, everyone. And please remember that if you are applying for the CLE credit, you must have attended for the full 60 minutes of the presentation, and you are required to complete the survey at the end. I know there are some individuals who had to cut out, and I will send you the survey via email. I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for attending, and most especially Ross Asher for his time and effort in creating this presentation. If you would like to speak with Ross, or if you would like to speak with TASA, a TASA representative regarding an expert witness for a case that you are working on, please contact TASA at 1-800-523-2319, and one of my colleagues will be in touch with you. This concludes our program for today. Thank you.